A mop, a man, a chapel draped in silence and old sunlight. Each night he cleaned the floors like he was tending to memory, not marble. Slow, careful, invisible. To most, he was just an old black janitor with tired hands and no story worth asking about. But that night, two white officers saw him differently, not as a man, but as a threat. No warning, no questions, just cold, metal, and cruel assumption. They thought they'd cuffed a nobody in a church. They had no idea. He was working undercover for the federal government. And within the hour, the FBI would come through their doors, not with apologies, but with authority. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. This story is about to unfold. Walter Briggs had cleaned the same church for nearly 12 years, yet every night it felt like a quiet reckoning with the past. The pews still held the faint scent of old hymnals and lemon oil, the wooden floors creaked in familiar ways beneath his boots, and the stained glass windows soaked the room in colors long after the sun had gone. He moved with a rhythm that didn't require thought, push, twist, pull, guiding the mop in slow arcs across the floor as if writing something only he could read. Outside, the wind stirred gently through the sycamores, and the rustle of dry leaves against the chapel walls made the night feel older than it was. It was past 9, and the sanctuary had emptied hours ago, leaving behind a silence that Walter didn't mind. He had come to prefer the world when it stopped speaking. The only sounds now were the soft swish of water in the mop bucket and the distant tick of the wall clock above the pulpit. He paused to straighten the folded cloth over his shoulder, glancing briefly at the photo taped to the inside of his cleaning cart, his wife Celeste smiling under the spring sun, gone now 6 years but never far. He often spoke to her in whispers when he thought no one was listening, just to feel like someone still was. His knees ached tonight more than usual, and his lower back sent up quiet warnings with every bend, but Walter didn't complain. He had lived through pain before, real pain, not the kind you could point to on a chart. Still, there was something in the air he couldn't quite name, something heavy. Not just the humidity or the late summer heat clinging to the windows, but a kind of weight behind his ribs, like waiting for a storm that hadn't been forecast. He was on his third pass across the center aisle when he noticed the headlights slicing through the stained glass, flooding red and blue shadows onto the altar. A patrol car parked close. He didn't stop moving, but the rhythm shifted slightly, his hands tightening on the handle of the mop as 2 car doors slammed shut, boots on concrete, then voices low but not low enough. "Why's he still in there this late?" one said. "Looks like he's trying to stay out of sight," the other replied. "Might be our guy." Walter didn't look up. Not right away. He recognized the voices, or at least their tone. He'd heard it in the 60s from men in uniform who didn't need a reason, just an excuse. He steadied his breath and moved the mop to the side, rolling it slowly toward the bucket. Maybe if he stood tall, answered calm, things would go easy. Maybe if he kept his hands where they could see them, it wouldn't turn into something it didn't have to be. The front door creaked open. Footsteps echoed across the tile, sharp against the quiet sanctuary. Walter turned slightly, meeting them halfway with a measured nod. "Even in officers," he said evenly. "Church is closed. Just finishing up." The taller one stepped forward, Deputy Clint Rowe, broad-chested, and always carrying too much authority in his stride. The younger officer, Brent Callahan, stayed behind, eyes darting over the room, unsure. "You work here?" Rowe asked, voice flat. "I'm the night caretaker," Walter replied, wiping his hands slowly on the rag from his belt. "Been with this church a long time." Rowe looked at him like he'd said something suspicious. "You got ID on you?" "It's in my wallet," Walter said, gesturing toward his cart. "You mind if I don't move?" Rowe snapped. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Walter blinked. "What kind of description?" Rowe didn't answer. Callahan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Rowe but saying nothing. There was a moment, brief, sharp, when Walter thought about arguing. Thought about reminding them that Reverend Haskins knew him, that his picture was on the hallway bulletin board next to the choir schedule. But he'd lived too long to believe that facts always mattered when skin came first. He raised his hands slowly, palms up. "I'm just cleaning," he said. "That's all I've ever done here." "We'll sort it out at the station," Rowe said. "Turn around." Walter hesitated. Not out of defiance, but out of heartbreak. Is that necessary? Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The handcuffs were cold and too tight. Rowe didn't ask if they hurt. Callahan avoided Walter's eyes. The silence between them felt louder than the cuffs, snapping shut louder than the old church bell that hadn't rung in years. Outside, the cicadas were humming low and steady. The squad car door opened with a metallic groan, and Walter ducked his head as he was led inside. His body folded in like habit, like resignation learned over decades. From the back seat, he stared at the dim outline of the steeple through the rear window, watching it shrink as they pulled away. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. There would be time for that later. For now, he kept his gaze forward and his mind quiet, letting the years wrap around him like armor. There were things he could say, things that might change their tone, shift their posture, but Walter had learned that silence, when used right, could cut just as deep. The car rolled through dark streets, each streetlight casting a flicker of judgment across the windshield. Rowe's voice droned about protocol, about just doing our jobs, but Walter wasn't listening. He was somewhere else, back in his younger years, back when he wore a different uniform and carried a badge of his own. Back then, people didn't look at him like this. Back then, his name meant something in places these two had never been. But tonight, none of that mattered. Not to them. Not yet. He sat still, not because he was defeated, but because he understood timing. He'd always understood timing. And something told him the hour had not yet arrived, but it was coming. He closed his eyes as the red and blue lights danced against the dashboard. In that rhythm, in that movement, he felt the early tremors of something shifting. They didn't know who he was, but they would. The holding area of the county station was colder than it needed to be. The kind of cold that wasn't just about temperature, but about control, about reminding you who held the keys and who didn't. The fluorescent lights buzzed low and constant, giving the pale cinder-block walls a sickly yellow tint, while a stale smell of burnt coffee and old paper hung in the air like regret. Walter sat on a wooden bench just inside the booking room, wrists still cuffed back, straight eyes steady, as if posture alone could keep him from unraveling. Across the room, Deputy Rowe stood by the desk, thumbing through a clipboard like he had all the time in the world, while Officer Callahan hovered behind him, his shoulders tense, and his eyes bouncing nervously from Walter to the floor. Name, asked the woman behind the desk. Officer Schultz, according to the metal tag pinned crookedly to her uniform. Her voice was flat, not unkind, but detached in that practiced way of someone who had learned to turn faces into forms and people into paperwork. Walter Briggs, he answered evenly, his voice low but clear, each syllable weighed and measured. Occupation, caretaker, part-time, St. John's Chapel. She didn't look up as she typed, the sound of her fingers tapping the keys fast and mechanical like someone swatting flies. Walter's hands itched beneath the cuffs, his fingers' stiff circulation slowing, but he said nothing. He had already done the math in his head, how long he could hold out without losing his calm, how much to say without saying too much, how long before someone bothered to ask the right question. Rowe walked past him toward the file cabinets, muttering to Callahan. You ever notice how they always play it polite when they're caught? Callahan didn't respond, but Walter noticed the way the younger man's jaw twitched, a flicker of conflict, passing through him like a shadow through glass. Walter had seen that look before, young officers pulled between what they'd been told and what they were starting to see for themselves. The air in the room thickened with silence, a silence that wasn't empty, but filled with 1,000 unspoken things, doubt, discomfort, the slow grinding of assumptions shifting just enough to be noticed. From the hallway came the faint clatter of boots, the occasional burst of laughter from behind a closed door, and a radio squawking unintelligibly before crackling back into static. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed briefly, then faded into the stillness of the night. Walter shifted slightly, letting his shoulder press against the cool wall, grounding himself in the texture of concrete, the raw scrape of reality. He studied Callahan quietly, noting the way the young man kept glancing his way, but never quite meeting his eyes. There was a tension there, guilt maybe, or curiosity, but whatever it was, it hadn't yet found the courage to speak. You know, Walter said gently, not confrontational, but with the calm weight of a man twice his age, you could have just asked the Reverend. He'd have told you who I was. Callahan blinked and glanced at Rowe, who said nothing. Schultz kept typing, her eyes still on the screen. Protocol Callahan mumbled finally, as if that single word could explain away everything. Walter nodded slowly, the motion deliberate. That word gets a lot of people in trouble when it's used instead of judgment. The truth of it lingered in the air, not loud but impossible to ignore. Callahan shifted on his feet, crossing and uncrossing his arms, the tip of one boot scuffing against the linoleum as if trying to disappear. Rowe walked back into the room, tossing a manila folder onto the desk with a thud, the sound sharp in the quiet. "Briggs," he said, voice clipped, "we've got someone who says you might be involved in a burglary across town." Walter met his gaze without flinching. "I've been at the church all night. You saw that yourself." "Description matches," Rowe said. Walter raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly was that description?" Rowe didn't answer. Callahan looked down again. The room fell silent once more, but this time it felt like something had shifted, the edges of the scene bending ever so slightly. It wasn't just about mistaken identity anymore. It was about the ease with which a man could be reduced to a hunch, a match in color, a convenient placeholder for someone else's fear. The bench creaked beneath Walter's weight as he leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, wrists still locked behind him, breathing steady. He wasn't afraid. Not really. He was tired in the way only those who have lived through decades of repetition can be. But tired didn't mean helpless, it meant he knew how to wait. From her station, Schultz finally looked up. Her eyes landed on Walter for the first time, just briefly, then flicked back to the screen. There was something in that glance, an almost imperceptible recognition, the smallest shift in how she held herself. Walter saw it, and so did Callahan. Outside, the wind picked up brushing dry leaves against the windows with soft, uneven whispers. In the corner of the room, the radio crackled again, and for a moment a hymn filtered faintly through the static, an old, spiritual something Walter hadn't heard in years. He closed his eyes just for a second, letting the sound settle over him like dust on old pews. The cuffs bit slightly into his skin, a reminder of where he was and what still lay ahead, but he didn't resist them. He was still in control of the one thing no one could ever take from him, his patience. Because deep down he knew this night wasn't over, not by a long shot. And sometimes the loudest thunder starts with the quietest breath. The phone rang at 10:13 p.m., a sharp, shrill sound that sliced clean through the monotony of the precinct's stale air. It wasn't the usual backline call that came in from deputies out on patrol, or someone reporting a loose dog or noise complaint. This line rang maybe once a week, and when it did, it demanded attention. Captain Monroe looked up from his desk, his hand pausing just above a half-filled mug of cold coffee, and reached for the receiver with the kind of hesitation born from experience. His voice was gruff when he answered, a mix of authority and fatigue. "Monroe," he said flatly, expecting maybe a state trooper checking in, or a dispatcher clearing a backlog. But the voice on the other end was neither rushed nor uncertain. It was calm, low, and unmistakably federal. "Captain Monroe," she said, her tone steady and clipped. "This is Special Agent Elise Warren with the Department of Justice. We have reason to believe you are currently holding a man named Walter Briggs in custody. Is that correct?" Monroe straightened in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the booking room through the open blinds of his office window. He could see Walter sitting on the bench, cuffed and quiet, like a man who'd been through this before and knew how long the wait could be. "We brought him in earlier," Monroe replied cautiously. "Suspicion of burglary." Still verifying his story. There was a pause on the line, not silence, but a kind of stillness that pressed down like a weight. "You need to release him." Immediately, Agent Warren said, and her voice no longer carried suggestion, it carried command. "Mr. Briggs is not an ordinary detainee. He is a federal asset currently embedded in an active witness protection assignment tied to a high-level corruption case. You are interfering with a federal operation." Monroe's jaw clenched, his free hand curling slowly into a fist on the desk. His eyes flicked again to the hallway, to the shape of Rowe moving past the break room with a coffee in hand, oblivious. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding," he muttered already, reaching for the notepad beside the phone. "He claimed to be a church custodian. That's all we have on file. You didn't run a background check before placing him in holding. I mean, we're still processing him," Monroe stammered, but the excuse sounded weak even to his own ears. "You've had him in custody for over an hour," she said. "This isn't just a matter of paperwork, Captain. This is a matter of jurisdiction, and the clock is ticking. You've compromised our operation and potentially placed Mr. Briggs at risk." Monroe swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the sweat gathering at the base of his neck, the way it itched beneath his collar like something accusing. He stood slowly, glancing once more at Walter, who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just sat there like a still frame in a shifting storm. "What exactly are we dealing with here?" he asked. "Because from what I've seen, he's just what, Captain," she interrupted, her voice steel now. "A black man with keys in his hand and a mop at his feet. He spent the last 6 months supplying critical intel on a network of judges and lawmen laundering money through backdoor land deals. We didn't assign him there by accident." Monroe didn't answer. He couldn't. His thoughts tangled into each other, bumping and looping in tight little knots. Rose's smirk when they walked Briggs in Callahan's unease, Schultz's shrug as she processed another form like it was just Tuesday. He felt suddenly smaller than he had in years, not because of what he didn't know, but because of what he hadn't bothered to ask. "I understand," he said quietly. "We'll take care of it." "No," Agent Warren said. "We will." She hung up before he could reply. Monroe stood for a moment, receiver still in hand, then slowly lowered it into the cradle and turned to the window again. Walter was watching him now, eyes steady, no anger, no fear, just that same quiet patience he'd worn since they walked him through the doors. It made Monroe uneasy, the way some people look at you, not with judgment, but with the knowledge that they've already seen how the story ends. He stepped out into the hallway, his boots clicking harder than usual on the tile. "Thompson," he barked to the night sergeant, "get Rowe and Callahan in my office. Now." Within minutes they gathered, their confusion mounting as Monroe laid out the basics, not the details, just enough to pull the curtain halfway back. Rowe's face tightened, jaw set with defensive pride, while Callahan looked like he might throw up. "You're telling me he's with the feds?" Rowe scoffed. That guy Monroe didn't answer. Instead, he walked back into the holding room and stood in front of Walter, who looked up calmly. "You've been very quiet," the captain said. Walter gave a soft smile, not sarcastic, not smug, just knowing. "Didn't seem like you were ready to listen." Monroe nodded just once, then reached down and unlocked the cuffs himself. They dropped with a metallic clink onto the bench between them, and the sound hung in the air like a bell tolling the end of something. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees along the perimeter of the station swayed in the breeze, and the clouds above the parking lot thickened like a warning. Monroe turned to Schultz. "Notify dispatch," he said. "We're about to have company." Because somewhere down that quiet road under the cloak of night, a convoy was already on its way, and they weren't coming to ask questions, they were coming to clean house. The rain had held off, but the air outside the precinct was thick, with that charged kind of stillness that settles in just before something breaks. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was waiting like breath held in a chest too long, like the pause between thunder and the crash. Inside the station was running on routine, its heartbeat slow and mechanical, unaware that change was already pulling into the lot. The front door creaked open as Schultz glanced up from her screen, fingers still dancing over keys, her expression unreadable until the first man stepped through. He wore a dark gray suit that fit too well to be local, and carried himself with the kind of focus that left no room for small talk. Behind him came 3 others, all in federal-issue jackets, their eyes already scanning every face, every corner, every detail, like it might hold a lie. The one in front flashed a badge, as crisp and unforgiving as his voice. "Special Agent Marcus Slater, FBI. We're here for Walter Briggs." Schultz stood so quickly her chair rolled backward and bumped into the filing cabinet behind her. Monroe emerged from his office, face drawn tight but composed like a man trying to maintain balance on ground he no longer trusted. "We were expecting you," he said evenly, though the words tasted like gravel in his mouth. Slater gave him a nod of acknowledgement, but not of respect. It was the kind of nod you give to someone whose time holding the reins has just ended. Walter was still seated on the bench near the back, calm as ever, hands now free, his gaze steady as the agents moved through the room. He didn't rise, not yet. He waited, watching them move, measuring their urgency, their pace, the way they carried authority like a second skin. There was no need for introductions. He recognized Slater the way a soldier recognizes another after a long separation, by posture, by weight, by the silence between words. Mr. Briggs Slater said, finally stopping in front of him, his voice shifting into something less official and more personal. "You ready?" Walter gave a small nod, not rising yet, just letting his eyes meet Slater's with that same calm he'd carried through every second of the evening. "Right on time," he said, voice barely above a whisper, but certain as gospel. Around them the precinct had gone still, the usual noise of radios and shuffling paper suspended as everyone waited to see what came next. Rowe leaned in the doorway of the break room, arms folded, mouth, a tight line, eyes, narrow and unreadable. Callahan stood near Schultz's desk, his hands buried in his pockets, his jaw clenched in a way that looked more like shame than anger. Slater glanced briefly at Monroe. "He's coming with us," he said. "Not a request, not even a formality, just a fact." Monroe stepped aside without protest. There was nothing left to argue. The rules had changed the moment that phone rang, and now the room belonged to a different kind of order. Walter rose slowly, his movements fluid, almost ceremonial, like he was stepping into something familiar but long forgotten. The floor beneath him no longer felt like concrete. It felt like resolution. He didn't look at Rowe or Callahan as he passed, but they looked at him because they had to. Because pretending not to see him now would have been worse than the cuffs they'd placed on him hours earlier. At the door, Slater paused, turning to address Monroe one last time. "This incident will be documented. Your department should expect a federal review in the coming days." Monroe gave a shallow nod, his eyes betraying nothing but the pressure building behind them. "You might want to start with internal training," Slater added, and though his voice remained calm, the words hit like a verdict. Outside, the night had thickened, the clouds swollen but not yet breaking the wind, tugging at loose papers near the sidewalk. The black SUVs sat with engines humming, low lights casting long reflections across the wet pavement. Walter stepped out into the air like a man coming up from underwater, breathing deep, not from relief but from memory. He turned just once, looking back at the precinct, not in anger, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. That place had not broken him, but it had revealed itself, and that was enough. Slater opened the car door and Walter climbed in without a word, settling into the seat like a man who knew that justice wasn't always loud, but it was always moving. Behind them, the agents climbed into their vehicles with quiet efficiency. No one barked orders. No one rushed. The storm that mattered had already passed through the building, and what it left behind was something heavier than rain: accountability, unfinished and echoing. As the convoy pulled away, tires rolling over the cracks in the pavement, Monroe stood in the doorway watching the taillights fade. He didn't say anything, not to Schultz, not to Rowe, not even to himself. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound small. He knew what this meant, not just for his department, but for the assumptions he'd allowed to live quietly under his roof. Inside, Callahan finally sat down, his shoulders slack, his eyes glassy, replaying the moment they stepped into that church, and decided not to listen. He didn't ask to be forgiven, he wouldn't have known who to ask. But for the first time since he put on the badge, he began to wonder what justice actually looked like and whether he'd been walking past it all along. And in the SUV, as the city lights bled into lines on the windshield, Walter closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in prayer. Not for himself, but for everyone who might still be sitting on benches like the one he'd just left, waiting in silence, waiting to be seen. The federal safe house wasn't flashy, and it wasn't meant to be just a plain brick building tucked behind a strip of closed hardware stores, the kind of place you'd pass 100 times without noticing. Inside, the walls were bare, except for a government-issued clock and a mounted whiteboard, filled with coded names and arrows that no outsider would understand. The lighting was soft but clinical, humming overhead like everything else in the room, low-controlled, precise. Walter sat at the end of a long conference table, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, fingers lightly drumming against a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't angry. If anything, he looked like a man who had waited a long time for this particular conversation. Across from him, Agent Slater laid out a fresh stack of documents, tapping the top folder once before, sliding it over. "They still don't get it," he said, half to Walter, half to himself, "even after everything we told them." Walter didn't answer right away. He leaned back in the chair, letting his shoulders ease into the creak of the plastic frame, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "People don't see what they don't want to," he said calmly, "especially when the truth messes with the world they've made up in their heads. Slater nodded, but the tension in his jaw didn't ease. He was younger than Walter by 20 years, but wore the same fatigue around the eyes, that quiet exhaustion that came from swimming upstream against politics, pressure, and people in power pretending they were blind. "We need to debrief," Slater said, gesturing toward the folder. "Not for the report, for the next move. You're the only one who's seen the whole picture from the ground level." Walter reached for the folder, but didn't open it yet. His hand rested on the cover, fingers splayed like he was pressing down on something living beneath it. "It started 3 years ago," he said softly. "Back when no one knew my name anymore. I took the job at the church because it was quiet and the silence didn't ask questions. I'd been out of the marshal's service almost a decade, mostly off the radar, until that boy in Monroe County called my old number by mistake." He paused, shaking his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He thought he was calling a retired officer who could help him file a report about missing land deeds. What he didn't know was that he'd stumbled into a whole mess nobody wanted uncovered. Slater sat still, letting him talk. He knew better than to interrupt a man like Walter once the gates had opened. "These weren't just backwoods scams," Walter continued, his voice low, measured. "They were coordinated moves, judges, clerks, even pastors involved. Property seizures under fraudulent liens, eviction notices signed in closed-door chambers, entire black families pushed off generational land without ever seeing a courtroom." He paused to take a sip of the coffee, grimaced, then set it aside. "It took one tip to realize the web ran deeper than anyone imagined. That's when I called you." Slater nodded once. "We had threads. But we needed a heartbeat. Someone they wouldn't suspect. Someone who could move quietly." Walter chuckled, not without bitterness. "An old black janitor in a church," he said. "They looked right through me. And that's what made it work." He finally opened the folder, flipping past maps and photos, coded spreadsheets and names scribbled in shorthand. "This town still thinks corruption comes in suits and handshakes," he muttered. "But the real danger wears denim and calls itself neighbor." Slater leaned forward. "Did Rowe ever connect to the Monroe County cluster?" Walter shook his head. "Number." But he was 2 phone calls away. He played the part well, aggressive, proud, hiding behind protocol like it was a shield. But he wasn't the top. He was a symptom. Outside the window, a distant train rumbled through the night, its horn echoing like a slow, warning breath over empty tracks. Inside, the only sound was the turning of pages and the rustling of truths long buried. Walter stopped on a photo-grainy low light taken from the rear pew of the church. It showed 2 men shaking hands in the back office, one of them wearing a county badge, the other a local judge no longer on the bench. "This," Walter said, tapping the photo, "was the night they exchanged a briefcase. I mopped the floor 10 feet away. They didn't say a word to me." Slater glanced at the photo, his eyes scanning it for details he'd already memorized. "You kept your cover too well," he said. "They really didn't see you." Walter looked up, his voice quiet but firm. "They didn't want to. That's the thing about people like them. If you're not in their image, you're not in their reality." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of weight, of meaning, of history. Slater didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. He just sat with it, letting the moment stretch. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, as if he were speaking not to a witness, but to a man who had carried something too long. "You risked everything," he said, "and they cuffed you like you were trash." Walter didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "That's why I'm not done yet." Slater looked at him, then at the files on the table, then back again. "You want to go public?" Walter smiled, but it wasn't joyful. It was heavy. "Not yet. But I want them to know I'm watching. That someone's still sweeping the floor, just not the one they think." And in that moment, it was clear that Walter wasn't just a man with a mop. He was a man with a memory, a mission, and a map of where the rot still lived. He had once worn a badge and carried a gun, but now his most dangerous weapon was the fact that they still underestimated him. The storm hadn't passed. It had only just begun. The church was quiet again, but this time it wasn't because everyone had gone home, it was because everyone was watching. Outside, beneath a wide southern sky, heavy with heat and tension, a crowd had gathered along the sidewalk and church lawn, their voices low, their presence intentional. Some stood with folded arms and solemn eyes. Others held handwritten signs with phrases like, "We see you and justice starts," here scrawled in bold strokes. And in the center of it all, Walter Briggs stood near the chapel steps, not dressed in his cleaning uniform this time, but in a simple gray shirt sleeves, buttoned posture, straight expression, steady as stone. He wasn't there to prove anything anymore. He was there to be seen finally on his own terms. Agent Slater stood to his left, arms behind his back, sunglasses tucked into his pocket, his gaze shifting calmly across the gathered faces. Behind them, two other agents kept discreet distance, not to control the scene, but to witness it. The event wasn't formal, no podium, no microphones, no banners flapping in the wind, but it held the weight of something that mattered. The kind of moment where words didn't need amplification to echo. Walter took one slow step forward, the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes, and for a second you could have heard a pin drop. He looked out across the faces, young, old, white, black, some familiar from Sunday services, others who had never set foot in a church, but now came out of principle. His voice, when it came, didn't rise above the breeze, but somehow reached every ear like a prayer whispered through open hands. "I cleaned this church for 12 years, he said. Most nights I was the last to leave, the only light still burning inside. I scrubbed these floors, polished these pews, kept the doors open so people could come and kneel and feel safe. But I've come to understand that safety ain't just about what's outside the walls, it's about what happens when no one's looking." He paused, letting the silence breathe, letting the truth sit with them. "I wasn't mistaken for a thief, because I acted suspicious. I was arrested because two men in uniform saw me and decided they didn't need to ask questions. That's what happens when power forgets to check itself. That's what happens when people stop seeing each other." From the edge of the crowd, someone murmured, "Amen," not as performance but as recognition. Walter didn't smile, didn't blink. He just kept going, letting the story finish in the open air where it belonged. "Now, I'm not here because I want an apology. I've been alive too long to put my faith in that. I'm here because I want change. Real change. Not just in this town, but in every place where a badge is used to silence instead of serve. I want policies rewritten, training that goes beyond checklists, and people willing to ask the hard questions before it's too late." He turned slightly, eyes meeting those of Monroe, who stood near the church door with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, sweat beading at his brow. It wasn't confrontation, it was an invitation. Monroe didn't move, but his jaw tightened and his gaze dropped, if only for a moment. From behind the crowd, the press had arrived. Cameras held steady lenses, catching not just faces but the subtle shifts between them. Emily Sanchez, a community organizer with a fire behind her eyes, stepped forward next, standing beside Walter without ceremony. Her voice rang clearer, younger, but carried just as much truth. "We're not here just for Mr. Briggs," she said. "We're here for every person who's been profiled, dismissed, detained, or discarded because they didn't fit the mold of who deserved trust. We're here because this story could have ended differently, but it didn't. And that means we have a responsibility to make sure the next one doesn't start the same way." Applause rose, not wild or deafening, but solid and shared like thunder rolling low across the hills. And in that sound was a turning point, quiet, but sure, as though something heavy had finally been placed on the table where no one could ignore it anymore. After the gathering, Walter remained behind, walking slowly through the sanctuary, now empty again. His footsteps echoed gently against the wooden floor. He'd polished so many times it almost reflected his image back at him. The air smelled of old incense, and sun-warmed wood and dust swirled softly in the golden shafts of light, spilling through stained glass. He paused at the front, placing one hand on the edge of the altar, breathing deep as if anchoring himself to every memory sealed in those walls. Slater joined him a minute later, his shoes making little noise on the tile, his jacket folded over his arm. He stood beside Walter for a while without saying anything, the two of them just facing the quiet feeling, the stillness, not as absence, but as clarity. "You think they'll listen now?" Slater asked finally, voice low. Not cynical, just tired. Walter didn't answer right away. He let his hand slide off the altar and turned toward the exit, toward the wide-open door and the bright afternoon beyond. "Some will," he said. "Some always do. The rest, well, they'll feel it eventually. That's how justice works. It waits, and it watches, and then one day it speaks loud enough no one can pretend they didn't hear. Slater nodded, walking with him toward the doors. Outside, the crowd had dispersed, but a few remained: an older couple sitting quietly on the steps, a teenager sketching in a spiral notebook, a mother wiping her child's hands with a napkin while keeping one eye on the church. Walter didn't stop as he passed them, but he did raise one hand in a small wave, and they returned it with quiet reverence. Not like a celebrity, not like a hero, more like someone they understood now in a way they hadn't before. He stepped out into the sun, the gravel warm beneath his feet, the cicadas humming again in the trees like a song that refused to be silenced. And as he walked, there was no music, no swelling score, no headline flashing across a screen, just the slow, steady rhythm of a man who had finally been seen for who he was, and who would never again let anyone pretend he was invisible. Because justice hadn't come crashing through in a blaze of vengeance, it had walked out calmly, head held high, carrying the truth like a lantern in the dark. And for those willing to look, that light would never go unnoticed again. Sometimes justice doesn't roar, it whispers. It shows up in the quiet dignity of a man who refused to be erased even when the world turned its back. Walter Briggs didn't fight back with fists or fury. He fought back by standing tall, by speaking softly, and by refusing to disappear. In the weeks that followed, his story rippled across towns, just like his places where power had gone unchecked for too long. Training policies changed. A few officers stepped down. Others, like young Callahan, chose to stay, but to stay different. And the people, they started to watch more carefully. They asked harder questions. They showed up not just when things got loud, but when things got quiet. Walter never went back to the night shift. But he did return to the church not with a mop, but with a message. He now meets with young men twice a week, telling them not just what happened to him, but what's possible when you hold on to who you are, even when others try to write you off. And maybe, just maybe, his story made someone in uniform think twice before acting first. Maybe it made a judge look deeper than a name on paper. Maybe it reminded a whole generation that dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you never lose, even when it's not returned. If Walter's story moved you, if it made you think or feel or remember, please like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more stories that honor truth, justice, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. Because some stories deserve to be heard not just once but again and again.